good morning or afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us in this conversation. And many thanks, of course, to the panelists who agreed to share their knowledge and thoughts with us today. I just wanted to give some input to the steering committee of WILIG, and obviously after the Dobbs decision, we thought, we wanted to launch a series of conversations just to reflect exactly what this means, particularly from our professional point of view, which is that of international law, but also more generally to start a reflection on where we're going and what is happening. And so this is where the idea of this first event came from, right? Because I work at the O'Neill Institute with Lucia, who kindly agreed to organize this with me. And we actually work a lot on reproductive rights, not me personally, but our team works a lot on reproductive rights in the Americas. And we see actually that, they are just seemingly diverging trajectories, at least for some countries. And so we thought it interesting to kind of try to compare and get different points of view about what is happening in the field of reproductive rights. So I think this is all this is just the first event. So for those who are very interested in the topic, Patti, who is actually our panelist, she will be organizing more events. So please keep an eye for more events to come. And I actually hope you enjoy this session. And I'll pass the word to Lucia.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Margarita. I mean, it is a true pleasure to be chairing this event, to be convening 4 fantastic scholars, activists, and just generally people that have made us think, that make us reflect on the realities of the Latin American region, the North American region, and in general from the Americas across, right? So the topic of today is reproductive rights in the Americas, diverging trajectories. We saw and we were a little bit kind of like concerned with the Dobbs decision, but we also want to be able to bring into the conversations a series of events, a series of developments and innovations that happen not only in the US, but in other regions of the Americas. They can bring a little bit more hopeful message or can show the challenges that we might be facing. So without further ado, I want to introduce my colleagues and very, very honored to have them here. So we have in the order in which the speakers will be sharing their experiences and the developments in their respective context. We have first Rebecca Ramos, which is the executive director of HIRE in Mexico. She is a Mexican lawyer with a master's in human rights and extensive expertise in sexual and reproductive health and rights. She started working at HIRE in January 2012 as a coordinator of the public policy advocacy, and in March 2020 assumed the position of executive director. She has worked as a parliamentary advisor and was part of the working group on constitutional reform and human rights. She's also the general coordinator of the Legal Center for Human Rights and has participated in various publications. From Chile, we have our colleague Maria Belén Saavedra, that is an associate with the Health and Human Rights Initiative at the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health. Prior to joining the O'Neill Institute, she was the chair of the board of directors of Amnesty International Chile. She has worked for the Ministry of Women and Gender Equality and a private law firm that focused on public law. She has lectured ethics, political philosophy, legal writing, and has a master's degree from the University Diego Portales in Chile. We have from the US joining us, Paris Kuster, that is a visiting professor at Temple University Beasley School of Law and a fellow at the Center for Public Health Law Research, where her work focuses on the regulation of abortion in criminal law. She has authored dozens of publications on such topics, partnering with law enforcement. She has focused also on legal barriers to abortion, US foreign policy, and self-managed abortion. Prior to joining Temple Law School, she spent 15 years with IPAS, a global health organization, where she worked in order to address legal risk in reproductive health and humanitarian settings and the regulation of self-managed abortion and telemedicine. So last but not least, we have Alicia Eliyamin, that is currently a lecturer on law and a senior fellow on global health and rights at the Petri Flom Center for Health and Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School, and an adjunct senior lecturer on health policy and management at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She is also a senior advisor on human rights and health policy at the Global Health justice organization partners in health. And particularly relevant for the conversation that we're going to have today, she's also a board member of RERAS and a member of the project MIRAR that is monitoring the implementation of the law that was adopted in Argentina in December in 2020, if I'm not mistaken. You please correct me if I am. So the plan of this conversation is that we are going to have our speakers sharing a little bit about their context, the developments that have happened, and what made those developments possible. Then we're going to have a little bit of a conversation about what we think the future will bring. So what are the future steps? Where do we see the challenges? And where do we see the potential to continue pushing forward for the recognition of sexual and reproductive rights and the enjoyment of these rights? And then we also want to be trying to interact with you, everybody that took the time to join us today. So we have a Q&A chat box that you can use to ask our speakers any questions that you may have, and that will be addressed at the end of the webinar. Yeah, so without further ado, Rebecca, the floor is all yours. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Lucia. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to share with you this conversation on what is happening right now in the Americas, and had happened a lot, in terms of abortion. And in the case of Mexico, I wanted to share what has happened in the last 15 years. I promise that it was just a little bit about 2007, when we here in Mexico started with a progressive regulation of abortion. But the first that I want to share is that the constitutional framework here in Mexico makes that every state in the country have to regulate abortion inside. It's not, we don't have a national regulation where we can decriminalize and make it the services as a right. So we have this regulation in criminal terms. Actually, is a general rule of our regulation, and that was happened on 2007, when the capital city, Mexico City, decided to decriminalize abortion in the first trimester of the pregnancy. That decision was questioned before the Supreme Court in Mexico. On that moment, on 2008, when the Supreme Court ruled that decision, they said that it was okay. Every local Congress had the right to decide when abortion is a crime and when abortion is a health service, and that is when we started with this progressive regulation. We have to wait 12 years to have another good resolution in legislative terms. We from 2007 to 2019, we only have in Mexico City the services to have abortion services, no matter what the reasons were for the women or for the woman or the person who seeks an abortion. And in 2018, we have not in the legal arena, but in the social arena, the wonderful news of what was happening in Argentina, and how this great movement, the Marea Verde, started in Argentina and contagious all over the region. But in Mexico, we receive it with great joy, and we can go out to the streets. We can wear the green handkerchief and ask unapologetically for a free abortion, free, legal and safe abortion. And on that moment in 2008, started this social decriminalization, this social movement, and then in 2019, Oaxaca, another state in Mexico, it's a southern state when we have a high rates of poverty, but also the population has a lot of indigenous people. we can decriminalize abortion in the same terms of Mexico City in the first trimester of pregnancy. And then, you know, the conversation, the public conversation arise, and we can talk more openly about abortion. And then, well, pandemic happened in 2020, and the movement, of course, in the streets, we have to lock down and no going to demonstration. But in terms of social media, and even though in some mainstream media channels or journals, we can talk about abortion. So we arrived at 2021, and in June we have two more states that decriminalize abortion in the first trimester. And then in September there was an historical decision. The Supreme Court was asked if the total criminalization of abortion was legal. And they in September, just on the last week, we celebrate the first anniversary of this ruling of the Supreme Court. The 10 members of the Supreme Court in Mexico decided that the total criminalization of abortion is unconstitutional. It was a different decision if we can compare of that decision in 2008, when they say, well, okay, every state can do whatever they want, but is your freedom of making law what happened on 2008, and now in 2021 they said that the total decriminalization was against the human rights, was against the Constitution. And then after this decision of the Supreme Court, 5 more states decided to decriminalize abortion in the first trimester of pregnancy. So right now we have this like a paradox. I don't know very well how to describe what we have here in Mexico, because in legal terms we are such a similar situation as the United States right now, that the decision is in every state. They can decide, and we have still 22 states where abortion is a crime. But also, right now, we have a Supreme Court decision that says that criminalizing is against the Constitution. But our legal system is different from the United States. This decision of the Mexican Supreme Court doesn't mean that every state automatically have to reform their own laws in terms of abortion. So there is where we are in a different situation from the states, but the conversation is still in the states. But also we have had in these years, in these 10 years, more satisfactory resolutions. You know, the tendency is to go and decriminalize abortion and recognize abortion as a health service. So we are now on that moment, and I want to share. You asked me, and one of the other things that we're going to talk about is what made possible these legal developments, and I think that there are many factors, many elements, not only in the legal arena. I think in what has happened in Argentina, in Colombia, in terms of social mobilization, has been very important. Marea Verde and the Green Handkerchief has been a very pushing element to get those developments in terms of abortion. But also I want to share that other things that has happened in the last 20 years here in Mexico is many work from the organizations as HIRE, but also the local organization and other national organizations as IPAS or Catholics for Choice. And we have had on these 20 years many work with the scholars, with academics. We have had in the medical arena, but also in the legal arena, many professors that has learned the arguments against the total criminalizations. They have learned teach to their students why is this a human rights matter. So I think that this has been a very important element that has arrived at the Supreme Court, not only with the justices, but with the staff of the justices. And we can see in those teams that there are many feminist lawyers, women and men, that recognize that abortion is a human rights issue. And we can see in the arguments of the resolutions of the Supreme Court, those arguments that they learned in the university. So I think that we have had these different elements, you know, all the work as human rights organizations, as feminist organizations in media, but also as an activist, the academic part that has been very important, and of course the social movement that has grown in the last years in America, in Latin America. And I think that I'm going to stop here to let my other colleagues talk and having this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to you, Rebecca. It's like fascinating, the evolution in Mexico and all of the wins that you were describing, right? And I think something that you highlighted so beautifully is like the role of social mobilization and the interconnection with the academia that are like producing and supporting and teaching these arguments that then get reflected in some of the decisions, which is, I guess, like something that we all are hopeful for here in this conversation. And with this, I want to welcome Maria Belén Saavedra to share a little bit of the experience from Chile that has very recent news, that has also suffered a lot of a lot of wins and a lot of backlash. So Mavi, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you for that, Lucia. I was actually planning a whole different presentation prior to September 4th, but history decided otherwise. And yes, we have a lot of news from Chile, and part of this conversation that I've named "The Pendulum Swings Back," because if we believe that progressive movements push forward a narrative, new changes, new laws, a new constitution, then we'll see that conservative forces will push back as well. And I believe that's what happened in Chile. So for a little bit of context and history, Chile, we cannot speak about repro rights currently in Chile without speaking about what happened on Sunday, September 4th. The draft of a new constitution was rejected. So for a little bit of history, Chile is one of the most conservative countries in Latin America. We only had a divorce law from the early 2000s. Prior to that, it was completely banned. Our abortion law came into place in 2017. Prior to that, we had a complete ban, and our current law is just 3 legal grounds, really restricted, with institutional objection of conscience. So from that, we know that Chile represents a really moderate and conservative country in terms of reproductive rights and human rights in general. However, there's been a movement building thanks to the Green Wave and other examples in Latin America regarding women's rights through the whole 2000s. There's been a huge feminist movement in Chile trying to make those changes happen. And so we got the 3 legal grounds, and that was like our first feminist victory or win from either progressive academia and the social movement. But repro rights still were a no subject. Like, they weren't touched upon in the executive or in the legislative branch. They weren't popular topics either for people to try to get behind them. In terms of social movement, that changed completely in 2019. There was a social uprising in Chile. It made international news. It wasn't about feminism or human rights at first. It was just like a public fair transportation increase, but it became quickly something else, a movement for more economic, social, and cultural rights, for more gender equality, for more labor rights, and that all translated into a demand for a new constitution. Our current constitution, and it's still current, it's a constitution that was drafted in a dictatorship. So there was a lot of movement trying to make that change. Within that movement, there was a movement called Nunca Más Sin Nosotras, Never Again Without Us. It was a movement from the feminist organizations trying to create gender equality in the drafting process. And it became a huge part of the new drafting process. So the new constitution was drafted by a constitutional convention with gender equity, so half and half women and men. And it also had a lot of representation of usually vulnerable and discriminated groups. And the process was deemed a success by progressive academia and from social movements. It enshrined more than 100 rights, including sexual and reproductive rights, comprehensive sexual education, the right to abortion, and the right to pleasure even. However, it also gained fair critics for being too maximalist, for being not so clear about the political system that was a completely new system, and because sometimes the role and work of the Constitutional Convention was seen as a bit performative, kind of like a circus in some ways. It was really criticized by more formal academia, more conservative academia, and also by some progressives even. That takes us to September 4th. The constitution, the new constitution, the draft was rejected by an overwhelming majority. There's no discussion about that. 62% of people in Chile said that they didn't want that. So what do we do now? Or where do we stand, right? And that's the question that I don't have an answer for, but I have a few thoughts about for this space. There was a study, and again, very preliminary because the vote just happened, about why people rejected the new constitution. There's a lot of fake news and misinformation, but there's also a lot of people talking explicitly about LGBTI rights and abortion. And those are discourses that we hear every time in every country. A lot of people were saying that people were going to get abortions on the 9th month. And I'm sure this we've heard in all countries. A lot of people were saying that women were going to have abortions just because. A lot of people were saying that abortion was a crime. And regarding LGBTI rights, they didn't want marriage equality, even though marriage equality is already legal in Chile. There was a lot of misinformation, but there was also a lot of a conservative movement from within, I would say, like common people that rejected this whole idea of such a huge change in every little regard of their lives, right? New rights, new political system, new legislative system, new constitutional court, new everything, right? And so that's one of the things that I wanted to highlight, that there was a lot of fear and we didn't know how to manage that fear. And I mean the progressive academia, the social movements, we didn't know what to do with that. We couldn't get the message across about how this could be an important win for people, for common people. It was just a discussion that was being brought up in progressive academia, in seminars, which I've shared with a lot of people that are here. It was like we couldn't make the point across of our messaging about how this was going to be a huge positive change in the common lives of people that are not always up to date with international human rights standards or what the different UN special procedures experts are mentioning about how positive this could be. We couldn't explain that in easy terms, whereas the opposition had really easy messaging about all of the things that made people really scared about this change. What comes next? I also feel like self-care. This has had a huge toll on progressive academics, but mainly in social movements. They've been working for this for the past 3 years, daily, without rest. And I do believe that we need to acknowledge that. I don't believe that there's going to be a huge movement in Chile for at least a couple of months, trying to resist this pendulum switch just because everyone is so exhausted about what's going on. So I do believe that we need to take that into consideration as well. Another thing that I wanted to point out is how this will inspire other countries. I was painfully aware about how we were being watched everywhere and how this could have meant a new green wave if we managed to codify sexual and reproductive rights in the way that it happened. But I'm now very, very aware of how this could mean a more conservative movement pushback in other countries in Latin America. And so I'm worried about that and how this messaging could prevent other changes in Argentina or in Mexico, even in Colombia specifically, and in other countries that were trying to see if this experiment worked, to see if they could change their constitutions or some parts of their constitutions in a way that was similar to the Chilean experiment. And also, I would like to say that the academic progressive movement, the Never Again Without Us, it's still very strong, and they're pushing for that the new process, whichever it ends up being, because we're not sure what it's going to be, to again at least has that ground that we already settled about, like gender equality and gender parity in the either experts or Congress or a new constitutional convention that is to draft the new constitution. But yeah, those were my key thoughts. I think that we need to learn about messaging. We cannot just trust international human rights standards to be the pathway where we need to talk about like strategic communications and how our messaging needs to be much more simple. And something else that I wanted to highlight is that there's still other pathways to try to move forward in sexual and reproductive rights. We can still try bills and law projects, and we can still try definitely a constitutional court. We have a constitutional tribunal, but trying to use the constitutional jurisdiction to make changes. But I do believe that Chile is going to be a little slower in that, just because of the overall exhaustion that still prevails in social movements. But I'm still hopeful. I do believe that we are learning as we go in something as different as this was, and I don't want to believe that the setback was because of women's rights. I believe we need to learn about strategic communications and messaging in terms of all economic, social, and cultural rights. We couldn't get the message across, but we'll learn from this and we'll stand up and we'll make the changes that we need to make. That's all.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Mavi. And I know that it's difficult to be hopeful only 8 days after the results of the referendum. So we really appreciate the message, but I think you highlighted a lot of really interesting things, right? Like the regional waves that are happening, the possibilities, both in a positive and in a negative way, right? Like we have a region that all these trends get contagious, and it's good if we monitor, if we understand them, if we kind of are able to foresee it. And a country that has shown the way in many ways, and the challenges in many ways also has been the US. So I want to give the floor to Patty to tell us a little bit of like where we stand with the new scenario, and what is coming, and how did we get here?
Yeah, thanks so much, Lucia. And it's really just such an honor. I'm so delighted to be here with all these amazing, fantastic co-panelists. And I wanted to lift up Margarita, mentioning this is part of a series. We have other panels upcoming on the Dobbs decision in international law, so stay tuned for those. So I'm here to kind of give the landscape in the U.S. And I guess I'll just start with the Dobbs decision. in June 24th to be specific, the Supreme Court ruled on Dobbs versus Jackson and overruled Roe and Casey, and basically ended the federal constitutional right to abortion before viability. So prior to Dobbs, Americans enjoyed the constitutional right to abortion no matter what state you lived in. And the court in its decision declared that Casey, the most recent case, the federal right to abortion under the Constitution, that the test had become unworkable. The court said that it was calculated to perpetuate litigation, that this would be an unwieldy and inappropriate task for judges under the previous law, and so therefore they were going to overrule it. Strike down the right to abortion was the theory, and we'll get the messy business of abortion regulation out of the courts and back, as the court said, return to the people and their elected representatives, and then everything will become much simpler, was sort of what the decision put forth. But here we are 12 weeks later, and it's a mess, like chaos, a morass. There's so many words to describe the tangle of law here in the US and at this moment, and then moving forward. So what I want to do kind of with broad strokes in my short time here is give a snapshot of the legal landscape for abortion at the state level in the US. Second, I'll describe kind of large buckets of open legal questions. And then lastly, just want to touch a little bit on the question of legal risk, particularly for people who help others get an abortion in America. So first, like a very quick summary of the legal landscape. Even before the Dobbs decision, when Americans enjoyed the constitutional right to abortion, there were a myriad of legal requirements that made it either impossible, very difficult, or delayed abortion. Things like parental consent requirements, bans on public funding, what we call trap laws, which are regulations on where abortion is provided that are onerous, non-evidence-based restrictions. So these all stand. These all stand in states like Pennsylvania, where I sit, that allows abortion, but still has this tangle of onerous regulations. But post-Dobbs, what changed is that abortion bans could be in effect. And so now I'm going to kind of paint a picture of what abortion bans look like in the US. When kind of the dust settles with abortion litigation on bans specifically, we're expecting about half of US states to ban abortion. Currently, we see 12 bans throughout pregnancy. Bans in 12 states, and then an additional 5 ban abortion at various points prior to viability. Some of these, or many of these, have no exceptions for health reasons. Some for no life exceptions, no exceptions for rape or incest, and then we have another 10 states that are litigating the status of abortion law toward what's expected to be bans. And then, of course, we have these civil liability statutes, which inflict civil liability on anyone who helps with an abortion. So the state of Texas pioneered this approach prior to the Dobbs decision. And then the state of Oklahoma filed suit. And basically, these are statutes that say that anyone involved with an abortion, very broadly, anyone involved with an abortion could be awarded $10,000 in damages, and they can file suit on behalf of a fetus. And so even, in theory, I could be, just some random individual in Texas who sues someone because they're aware that they helped with an abortion. So the Supreme Court declined to review the Texas statute prior to Dobbs, but there are at least one lawsuit moving up the court to challenge this. And so right now the statute stands, but there's further litigation on that. We also see some states are protecting the right to abortion. So for example, the Michigan Supreme Court just on Thursday said that Michigan moved forward with a referendum to protect abortion in the Constitution. And then there's other states like Pennsylvania where the state courts are deciding whether or not the state constitution protects the right to abortion. So we're seeing some constitutional protections at the state level. But overall, it's somewhat in flux, broadly speaking, for about that half of U.S. states looking to ban abortion, and it's an extremely partisan issue in the U.S. And so the bans really fall. The Republican states tend to have bans. When, my own state of Pennsylvania, if we get a Republican governor, then we're likely to see a ban here. So it's really going to continue to change as the political landscapes might change one way or the other. So that's basically like the broad strokes. There are certain details. The bans are various gestational limits. Some have exceptions, some don't. Some punish only the person who helps with an abortion. Some punish the pregnant person as well. And these details, I'll just mention, the Center for Public Health Law Research here at Temple is tracking some of the minutia, which in a way that makes it easier to quantify, to say X number of states, ban abortion prior to 5 weeks and details like that. So after kind of giving the broadest of possible landscapes on state abortion law in the US, I want to just name a couple kind of buckets of legal questions that are open and really will keep lawyers and courts busy for years to come. The first is around travel. So the question of, can people freely travel completely across states? Can people share information across state lines? Can people mail pills across state lines? So like more generally, if I'm like driving in Texas and I hit you with my car and then I flee to Massachusetts, the Massachusetts state authorities in general will cooperate with Texas to either bring me to Texas for civil suit or for criminal charges in order to bring me to justice. But in the case of abortion, it gets more tricky. So if I go to Texas and help you with your abortion and then flee to Massachusetts, the Massachusetts state authorities might do something different. Abortion supportive states like Massachusetts have started passing bills that prevent law enforcement authorities from cooperating with requests from other states. And these are kind of deemed abortion shield laws. They could apply to the civil statutes or the criminal statutes. And they're enforced in various states. I can just name Massachusetts, California, New York. And so also within the kind of bucket of the question of abortion travel, of course, we have abortion pills. In the US, more than half of all abortions are with medication. The standard in the US is misoprostol with mifepristone. And under a decision during COVID by the FDA, our drug regulatory agency, abortion pills can be mailed. So a prescriber can mail the abortion pills. But so many questions remained. What if the prescriber is in an abortion supportive state, but the person receiving the pills is in an abortion hostile state? Or what if the person in the abortion hostile state goes across state lines to Massachusetts to get the pills and then carries them back to Texas to have an abortion? And so all kinds of jurisdictional questions remain. What if somebody's just merely giving information about where you get pills to someone in Texas, but they're sitting in a different state without an abortion shield laws? So these are all questions. I will say that, that people, well, I'll get to it when I talk about legal risk, but all of this confusion is really causing people not to want to help in abortion, because there's just so many questions that remain at this time. The question of whether people can freely travel across state lines was addressed by Justice Roberts in a concurrence in the decision. He seems to think that the US Constitution protects people's ability to travel, but Justice Roberts isn't needed for a majority deciding abortion cases. We have a strong right wing, and they don't even need Justice Roberts. So I think that question really remains open. The second legal question has to do with the power of the federal government to preempt state law. So that is, can federal law go above, more or less, state law on abortion? One example of this is EMTALA. This is a 1986 federal law on Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act. And what this says is basically, if you go to a hospital and you need emergency treatment, the hospital has to provide it. And in some cases, abortion is needed as emergency treatment. And so EMTALA has this requirement, but what if it's in a state where abortion is prohibited? So here we have a conflict of law. And the government has been super proactive. So our federal government under the Biden administration hasn't been the best abortion supporter, but has been proactive. In this case, where the administration issued guidance actually that said that this law, EMTALA, applies to abortion cases. In response, the state of Texas sued the federal government to say Texas law applies here. And then the federal government also sued the state of Idaho to preempt a state statute that would have banned abortion. So now we're right now sitting with two district court decisions that are conflicting, and that will give an opportunity for it to go up through the federal court system. There are other preemption questions. Can federal government allow abortion on federal lands? With regard to abortion pills, the FDA has approved mifepristone to terminate pregnancy, and so basically that's the realm of the federal government, is approving mifepristone. And so when the state bans the use of mifepristone, there's a conflict of law. And with all of these, U.S. Constitution says when there's a conflict, federal law takes precedence. And so these questions are out there on the table. And I just want to mention that it's really my colleague Rachel Rabochet, Greer Donnelly, and David Cohen, all brilliant Pennsylvanians who have written a lot about these issues of federal preemption and the questions that remain. So lastly, I just want to touch a little bit on legal risk, kind of, if you'll indulge me with just some sort of thoughts on legal risk. States, all of them, regulate abortion on the criminal law, which means that people who are involved in abortion, whether it's sharing information or actually performing abortion, face risk of prosecution, risk of arrest, face legal risk. And we also know both from data outside the US across the years, but also more recent data by Abigail Aiken inside the US, that when we have more restrictions on abortion, people will increasingly, a larger number of people will self-manage their abortion. And that's to say abortion outside a clinical setting. So it's quite easy to say, pregnant people, we shouldn't prosecute them. And there's been a tremendous amount of work on that by National Advocates for Pregnant Women, a lot of legal scholars. But the question that I'm sort of puzzling over is, what about the people who help? Not that they're more privileged or more important, but just to say, that's a question we haven't really thought about, is like the people who help. Abortion clinics that were operating in states that banned abortion aren't operating there anymore. They're not taking on that legal risk. They have a lot of reasons not to. Some of them are licensed medical professionals. Some of them already are known entities. So they're not, the Planned Parenthood affiliates, independent abortion providers who are medical professionals are less likely to take on legal risk than friends and family, people who can get pills. And I just want to lift up some work done recently by IFLA and Howe, where they tracked people who have been prosecuted for self-managed abortion, found kind of, I won't judge them, but 61 people over the past 20 years or so who have been convicted for either self-managing their own abortion or helping someone. But in this political environment, I think we can predict that number is going to go up. All in a context where the US, here compared to any other country in the whole world, we have astronomical rates of incarceration in the US, more people in prison per capita than anywhere else, and a criminal justice system that really targets people who already face discrimination, already face structural racism and poverty. And so we're really, in this kind of context, we're really thinking about communities that already face criminalization, and then here's another law. There has been some movement, recognizing that prosecutors have discretion. That here we have phenomena here where, like in my city, Pennsylvania, we're in kind of a red state legislature, looking at prosecutors that might be progressive, sitting in states where abortion might be banned, who would exercise discretion. And in fact, there's been a statement by over 100 prosecutors saying that we're not going to prosecute anyone who is involved with an abortion, which is terrific politically. But as we move forward, it's going to get tricky. The people that I know who provide abortion or working in the abortion field in the US are like some of the bravest, like most compassionate people. The environment is really tough. But it could change. Like in other countries, illegal abortion is super profitable. So is that going to change who's involved with the field? Or what if like abortion charges are the one thing that the prosecutor can get for someone that they've targeted for a long time? I think it's really going to get tricky as we move forward in terms of prosecutorial discretion and who is safe from legal risk and who isn't. So those are like mostly just questions in my musings. So just thinking about it ahead, you know, not prosecuting is certainly something that that should be applauded, but at the same time, I think it gets tricky in our racist criminal justice system in the U.S. So just to add, by reminding everyone, the Dobbs court was basically like, abortion's too complicated in constitutional law at the federal level. Let's just put it back to the states. But instead, it's really been chaos and confusion, and things are moving forward. But I think American lawyers in court certainly will have a lot of work getting through the quagmire moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Patty. And as you were speaking, it is very clear, like the chaotic and the uncertainties, right, that surround abortion in the US at the moment. And I want to introduce also Alicia, which will take us from these questions, right? A set of like uncertainties that do not particularly help, as you were saying. People are being fearful about providing support and providing help and closing clinics, to a country that like Argentina, that gave us a lot of certainties and a lot of answers, at least to some of our questions in 2020 and 2021. So Alicia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lucia, and thank you to ASIL and to the organizers. It's really a treat and a privilege to share the panel with people who I deeply respect and have been in this field working alongside. I am going to talk about a comparison between the United States and Argentina, trying not to duplicate what Patty was just talking about too much, but drawing on themes that Rebecca, Belen, and Patty have all mentioned. I am a US trained but international lawyer with family in Argentina, and I have long participated in the movement in Argentina. I was privileged to testify in Congress when it came up, and as Lucia said in her introduction, have been quite closely involved. I do want to uplift and recognize that much of what I've learned about the historical struggle for abortion rights in Argentina comes from Argentine colleagues, both legal academics like Paola Vergallo and Augusta Romo Michel, Natalia Gerardi, and also activists who have been working on this for years, like Silvina Ramos and others. So let me start with the passage of Law 27-610, which I'll just call the law that legalized abortion until 14 weeks of pregnancy, and then thereafter maintained largely the same exceptions to criminalization that had been in effect since the 1921 Criminal Code, with the exception that in 2012, there was an important judgment from the Supreme Court of Argentina that expanded the rape exception from just the rape of people who have intellectual disabilities to rape in general. So it is legal. It is called in Argentina voluntary interruption of pregnancy in the first trimester through up till week 14, and thereafter it is called legal interruption of pregnancy, or ILE. Now, I wanted to just sort of to organize my thoughts. I want to talk about how Argentina and the United States draw on a different universe of norms, and which also affects the kind of interpretation of our Constitution. Second, the socio-political context, which has evolved over these years. I want to give a little bit of background and not just a snapshot of what it is today. Contrast a little bit about the role of social movements and organizing, and then maybe say a word or two about health systems. So in Argentina, first of all, this is an international law panel, and international law, international human rights law has been extraordinarily important in Argentina in general after the civic military dictatorship, but also in terms of expanding reproductive and sexual rights. Contrast that with in the United States, and especially notably in the Dobbs opinion, you know, people can argue if it's really originalism or if it's a selective historicism, but I think it's clear it's like a fixation thesis of fixing the interpretation of norms at a certain point and largely disregarding the evolution of conceptualizations in international law and elsewhere in other countries. So in Argentina, that is quite different. In the 1994 amendments to the Constitution, there was an incorporation of international human rights law through this mechanism called the Constitutional Bloc. And from the very beginning, that was used not just by progressives, but also by the conservative forces as argument points, right? So the conservative forces early on pointed to Article 4 of the American Convention on Human Rights and argued that life begins at conception because of that provision. That was and that really lasted until there was an opinion in 2012 in Artavia Murillo versus Costa Rica by the Inter-American Court, where the Inter-American Court interpreted that not to include life from conception, but an evolving, iterative, progressive understanding of how life begins. On the progressive side, from close to the beginning of the elaboration of concepts of reproductive rights in international law in the Vienna Conference in 1993, in the International Conference on Population and Development in 1994, and the Beijing Conference on Women in 1995, those concepts of women at the center of making decisions about their bodies and connecting that to political, economic, social institutions and democracies have played a very, very important role. The CEDAW convention earlier also was very useful for beginning to break down the public-private divide, which of course has excluded many reproductive rights issues from the realm of reasoned argument and political contestation, as have been sort of general comments along the way, important decisions in different treaty monitoring bodies, concluding recommendations. That has been a very important tactic and use, both in terms of conceptualization and, to use Sally Engelmary's term, vernacularization of those universal concepts into more concrete terms of what it meant in the Argentine context. But it's also important because once the issue goes to an international forum and comes back, or there is a concluding recommendation or a general comment, that means that it is no longer just a matter of health, just a matter of a lapse in quality of care, but a matter of injustice that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Ministry of Justice, and more broadly society, needs to confront. And that has been a very important part of this trajectory in Argentina. The political context, I think, also matters to this story. So Argentina is well known for its extremely polarized politics, and I'll come back to how when this issue came to Congress in 2018, that was overcome. But the polarization goes back a long time, and if I really had enough time, I would start the story more around the time of Roe in the early 70s, when feminists around the world, not just in the North, were thinking about abortion rights in the early 1970s, under the then Peronist regime, there was a narrative of abortion and contraception being imposed from the north as part of imperialism. Then during the dictatorship, contraception was banned, and abortion was, of course, out of the question. And when democracy returned to Argentina, this was not immediately on the table, but the notion that it was a matter of human rights was immediately grasped onto by feminists who were part of broader civil society movements for human rights. After the Alfonsín administration, another Peronist called Carlos Menem came to power. And during those times in the 90s that I had just said were very important to progressive feminist advocates because they looked to ICPD and Beijing, et cetera, the Menem administration in Argentina was on the other side, was with the conservative Islamic states, was with the Vatican, et cetera. Very different position. That kind of going back and forth and finding allies within the government was also extremely important. There were several ministers of health who really took on this issue. Now compare that and that went on through a number of economic crises that Argentina suffered as well. In the United States, the political context in the 1970s was very different, and many have argued, and I'm not going to go into all the details about this, that Roe v. Wade actually fostered a huge backlash against progressive reproductive rights. There was, the women's liberation movement, and more widespread access to contraception was key in the 1970s. It was, and conservatives, I think, has been well documented, saw a kind of moral high ground that they could no longer claim from saying, women can't be allowed to work in the workplace, Blacks can't be allowed to be in our schools, et cetera, on this anti-abortion issue. It was a wedge issue for conservatives. Now, fast forward, in Argentina, when this came to Congress in 2018, and it really had not been a major issue in Congress before then, the major players had been regulatory agencies battling it out between provincial regulatory agencies and the federal government as things went back and forth, and the courts. But in 2018, this sort of center-right administration of Mauricio Macri allowed this to come to Congress without really supporting it, but allowed it to come to Congress. And what was key in that time was that there were a number of Congress people who were known as the sororas, the sisters, who had worked on other issues together across the aisle. So parity, issues relating to SOGI rights. And they were able to come together and work on the basis of trust and knowing each other on legislation that passed the Chamber of Deputies in 2018. And during that time, there was just an amazing outpouring of social outreach, awareness raising, discussions from, kitchen, not just in the legal formal institutions of state, but from kitchen tables to taxi cabs, really an amazing, unprecedented amount of outreach and discussion. That in 2018, it passed the lower chamber of deputies and was narrowly defeated in the Senate. And I was there and participated in conversations thereafter about, should we go back? Should we try again? Or not? Should we continue on with different strategies around the margins? But the feminist movement did go back And despite the fact that there was the pandemic, despite the fact that during the pandemic, the economy, really even before the pandemic started, the economy was really in grave crisis in Argentina. These same sororas continue to work together and act together. And in 2020, they had a slightly different strategy where they got kind of buy-in from the Green senators before it went to the Senate to preclude the idea that there might be further legislative changes that would then have to be open up and renegotiate, right? This is a time of Zoom during the early pandemic. It was much harder to do that kind of negotiation. And over Christmas break, which is Argentina and most of Latin America is a huge deal, they managed to get it through. So the third thing I want to point out as a bit of a contrast is the social movement organizing strategy. Again, this goes back to really before democracy returned to Argentina and is seen as part of engendering, expanding democracy. And I would say the Dobbs decision is a radical shrinkage of democracy in this country. But a national campaign on abortion rights was founded in 2005 in Argentina that included a continual expansion of new actors, the labor movement, the largest labor confederation, LGBTQ groups who changed the language of the law, talks about gestating persons, not just women, and that was key. Who worked and reached out to the mass mobilizations around gender-based violence and femicide, which was also extraordinarily important for making this not an issue of academics or dissidents, but a mass movement. Mainstream human rights groups actually took longer to join the campaign than some of these other actors. But the labor movement, for example, was critical to understanding that abortion and reproductive autonomy is necessary for women to be able to participate in the economy. And that was a major narrative, as opposed to what we have seen in the United States, I think. There also was a huge and long-term outreach with formal and informal providers. There was a movement of so-called socorristas that provided information and got misoprostol out to people, even when before the law. And the Red AS, on which I'm on the advisory board for, was doing trainings with providers in the formal healthcare system, sometimes, just a handful at a time, to create a sense that they were part of a larger network, and also to shift their own view of themselves as, from abortionist to really a champion for reproductive rights. And I think that's going to be difficult in the United States because, as Patty referred to, before, the people who were in the Planned Parenthoods, who were in the whole women's healths, were champions of reproductive justice. But now, when those are closing down, we are going to see a lot of these questions go to the main part of our health system because abortion has been segregated off. And those people are unlikely to want to take the same risks that Patty was just talking about. So I think that's an important thing to consider in our health system. I also want to signal that in Argentina, this is financed, right? So it's financed through the public health system. The amount of misoprostol that has been purchased for medication abortions in Argentina has doubled since the law was passed. And it does provide for conscientious objection, but only by individuals, not by institutions. And if there is a private institution or an institution of obras sociales, which is the social insurance scheme, that does not provide the abortion, they reimburse the public system for providing that abortion. So I don't know how much more time I have, but I just would close with this. You know, the Argentine experience to me reveals the importance of this kind of dialogue and expansion to the evolving standards in international law, but it also belies some views in the human rights field about how international law works, as though it is applied from the top down, as though we can understand the impacts of General Comment 14 or General Comment 22 from the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights just by looking at changes in laws. I don't think that is true. The Argentine experience is much more about the recursive use of international law, where the concepts are vernacularized, adapted, used and deployed, reconstructed, and then taken up by international institutions and forums, as we've seen the kind of evolving overlapping consensus in international law between the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights as part of the fundamental right to health, the Human Rights Committee as necessary for a life of dignity, and CEDAW as part of eradicating structural violence against women. But the point of this is that it's really about using human rights and making people care. The green wave has been so successful because people understand what it means in their lives and how it relates to abortion, not because of some international panel that says this, not because of a bunch of technical guidances. And I think this is a lesson for us that picks up on some of what Belén was saying about Chile, but a lesson for us who circulate in international spheres as well. Okay, I'll stop. I'm sorry, I probably went over.
That's great. Thank you so much, Alicia. And I think that is like definitely a learning for all of us that do work on like policy or advocacy at the international level, right? Like, how do we make sure that we are not, contributing to a bill, to a system that only operates from the top down. And I want to make room and have a little bit of a conversation around the questions that are coming in the chat box. And I remind everybody that is attending the webinar that you can ask questions to the panelists in the Q&A chat box. And there's a question here about the question is, and I'm gonna read it for the panelists to chime in, and it says like, focusing on state laws in the US obscures the threat of a national ban, right? So Republicans have promised to pursue a national ban on abortion, and a fetal personhood case is under consideration of the Supreme Court. So how do we as advocates can deal with this threat? And I will let maybe Patty or Alicia to comment on this.
Yeah, and I wanted to, before I do that, sort of pick up on something Alicia raised, which I think is so important, is this, I'm putting it in quotes, originalism, which is, purports to be, you look at the Constitution and you see what it says and you think back what it meant originally, and it's a value neutral proposition when you're interpreting the Constitution, and that's a way, this is all in quotes, by the way, for judges not to impose their personal values. And that's sort of purportedly through the Dobbs decision, what's supposed to be happening at our Supreme Court right now. And in fact, Riva Siegel just published an interesting history of originalism that really goes back to sort of a reaction to all of the social movements, social changes that were happening in the 60s and 70s, and originalism really, and articulated this way from the 80s, being a way to reinforce traditional values, reinforce white male power in the face of a diffusion of power to other people. And so that's the Supreme Court that we have, and that's the Supreme Court that at some point probably will be asked to consider a national ban. As is mentioned, there is a fetal personhood cert petition right now at the Supreme Court. Other state legislatures certainly are looking at fetal personhood. There's a lot happening with regard to trying to enforce rights, the rights that all Americans have to fetuses at the expense of the right of the people carrying the fetus. And so that's certainly, you know, in the future something to be concerned to be concerned about. It's certainly looming. And just to, the other thing I wanted to lift up, and kind of in the face of that and thinking about advocacy, we do have, I mean, the US in terms of social movements has changed a lot from like the 90s under Casey until now, in that the reproductive justice movement has really gotten more purchase. The New York Times was covering the US in front of the CERD committee for the first time, which was remarkable. Usually when the US is in front of a human rights body, there's no coverage, but this time there was, and we can see the reproductive justice movement was started in the 90s by Black women and has really grown to represent not just abortion, but the right to have children, the work-related rights as well. And so really to broaden the movement for reproductive freedom here in the US. And so I definitely see hope there, but you know, we definitely have a worrisome court in power. There's no, and you know, really looking ahead, there is a tremendous threat from fetal personhood initiatives.
Thank you so much for that, Patty. Yeah, please go ahead.
No, I would just add that, you know, I think Mary Ziegler, who was a visiting professor at Harvard Law School last year, definitely sees the fetal personhood as the end game for the conservatives. So, but I would also say that this doesn't just affect abortion, right? It affects access to assisted reproduction. The same reasoning that the Supreme Court threw away and may affect contraception and a number of other rights that we have come to take for granted in our system of ordered liberty in the 21st century. So yeah, keep posted.
Yeah, definitely it's keeping us on our toes, trying to understand, conceptualize, and work on this field. And as Alicia was saying, this is spilling over in other areas, right? Like this is a matter, the conversation starts about abortion, but actually it entails much more. It entails gender norms, it entails other areas of health and so on and so forth. And we have a couple of questions here, but I think I'm going to use my power faculties as a moderator, because I want to be mindful of everybody's time. And Viviana is asking here about like some reflections around how each country, or the stories and the learnings from each country, can influence the movement building, particularly in each of our countries. So what I would ask, if that's possible from our speakers, is a couple of final reflections about where do you think the areas, the potential, those spaces in which work is possible at the moment, and that you can maybe draw inspiration from other jurisdictions. So where do you see those places and that hold transformative potential? Shall we start with Rebecca?
Sure. No, I think that one of the great lessons here in Mexico has been this the building of this broader movement. I was hearing Alicia talking about Argentina and how it was not only a feminist issue, a feminist movement. It was broader with LGBTQ movement, but also with this intergenerational work. And I think that here in Mexico, we one of the lessons is to work more connected with other movements, because and I connected with the social movement in terms of the social decriminalization, how we have to deal and to fight against a stigma around abortion, because there are a lot of arguments that are against the agency of persons with disabilities or persons with the capacity of gestating. So I think that one of the great lessons for us here in Mexico is to make it wider, and what Maria Belén was saying, to be very clear with when we are talking to people in general, not to go with the very technical language and the legal language. We can use that with the justices, we can use that with the Congress, but with people, and make it a social issue, a social complaint by people and how it affects in their daily life. So I think that we are there in Mexico, and trying to protect what we got, and go further, because we have a long path to have a legal and safe abortion for everyone in Mexico. But I think that we are in the path and working on that.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Mavi?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree completely with the idea of having a strong social movement. In Chile, for the social uprising, the umbrella term of the social movement was dignity, and that included labor rights, healthcare, education, sexual and reproductive rights, and a lot of other topics that have never been discussed before. And that helped the movement to be intersectional and to have actual power of mobilization and change. I will say, though, that even with such a broad umbrella term, what I figured out on September 4th was that power of social movement does not equal organization or like actual results. We had a final for the Constitution event that had like almost 1 million people versus a 200 final event for the against the Constitution of 200 people, and the against vote won overwhelmingly. So a social movement taking up the streets via pink hats, green waves, whatever, doesn't equally measure into political power and change and electing progressive officials. So I think that's something that we need to figure out, how we move from a social movement that has a lot of power in the streets and a lot of like visibility towards a movement that can actually make political change, and how that's institutional political change, and how that's related, because I think that happens in the US a lot. Like you have a big protest, a big pink hats movement, and then that doesn't translate to more progressive officials. And that's what happened to us as well. So I'm adding that layer of difficulty to the conversation. But yeah, I agree. We need more intersectional movements.
Thank you so much, Mavi. Patty?
Yeah, just to reiterate, more intersectional movements, really more people recognizing that people who have abortions also need a right to work. Particularly people who face barriers to abortion, might also be struggling with other health issues, with having the right to parent, other issues, and so really, I think we've dealt with abortion on both sides here as a single issue. And it's really not. And then along with that, also diversifying. I mean, I'm sort of thinking from a funding investment perspective, more locally. It's no secret that the Republican Party has really started to mobilize the localist of races, and there tends to be a lot of media attention and action at the national level when it comes to activism and elections, and so I think that's starting to be recognized, particularly in abortion funds that work very locally are getting more attention and resources that they need as well. But diversifying, in terms of both national to local level as well.
Thank you so much, Patty. And I think with regards to the US, the funds have played such a fundamental role, right? In like before and in us in this moment of like transition, if you want, or the moment of uncertainty. I think they have really been at the front lines. Alicia?
So I would echo what has already been said. I do want to emphasize the Argentina story is not over. The passage of the law was an inflection point, but the battle against these, what Rachel Rebouchet talks about is kind of the stickiness of informal norms and background norms continues. There is a case from Salta where a doctor performed what is a legal abortion under the law, is being prosecuted, and that may go to the Supreme Court. So, this is an area of constant contestation. And again, some of what I've learned largely from my colleagues and compañeras in Latin America is, like Vilma Ibarra, who is the chief counsel to President Fernandez now, don't leave the streets. Feminist appropriation of public space has been extraordinarily important on a whole wide range of issues. And I think we really need to take that intersectionally across races, classes, everything, generations in the United States. Also focus on the infrastructure of rights delivery, the health system, which is an absolute mess in the United States, but also all those other economic and social rights that actually underpin reproductive justice. Again, quite a mess in the United States, but we really can't just focus on this as a single issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alicia. Yes, definitely. I would let Margarita to give us some final reflections, and then I will close the event. Margarita?
Thank you so much. And has been a wonderful and really enlightening conversation. I'm aware that we only started sketching the debates, right? I mean, we could have said so much more. I had a lot of questions. I couldn't use the Q&A button as I'm listening as panelists, but I really had so many other questions, but I'm sure we will continue answering them in the new events that Patty will organize. So, but it has been truly great. And what I think I wanted perhaps to say with respect to we discussed, so the title of the today's event was Diverging Trajectories, right? And I think in the end, at least what I learned and what I think emerged a bit from the debate is that, I mean, the trajectories can look divergent in some ways, but they're also much more similar than they could look like. So we heard, right, for example, the decision in Mexico was so much celebrated last year. It was really like, like it's great, Mexico is great, but we heard actually there are still a lot of gray areas and problems, right? And Chile as well, obviously, was going in such a wonderful direction, and now there is this huge setback because, I mean, it's no way to deny, but that as Belen told us, it doesn't mean that all hope is lost. It's just we need to reorganize. And the same, obviously, Argentina has gone through different waves. There is so much is already in place, so much still needs to be done. And I mean, the United States, actually, I think it was the comment where Patty started, right? So we thought, I mean, some people may think that everything was okay before the Dobbs decision, but actually wasn't. I mean, there were already very big structural problems. So even in a context where the right was seemingly protected at the federal level, at the constitutional level, actually in the implementation, there were still a lot of issues, and that's the same case for obviously a lot of other countries. So we could, as I said, we have only started sketching the debate, and I apologize, but just we couldn't make a marathon of 3-4 hours. It would have been very mean from our side, but I think it's really been wonderful contributions, and I really thank you all. And I hope this has left our participants with the idea a bit, yes, that, well, I don't know if it's the need to reorganize, but just the awareness that sometimes things go, that the progress indeed, as we have learned, is not just one way forward, but there can be many roads aside and sometimes a bit, backwards, but it doesn't mean that everything is lost. It just means that things are not as easy as they may seem on the surface, and that's something that lawyers also say very often. Really, thank you so much, and thank you, obviously, Lucia, for the wonderful moderation.
Thank you, Margarita. And well, thanks everybody, to all of the participants that joined us today. Thank you to our speakers. And as Margarita was saying, this is the kickoff of a larger conversation that we're trying to convene here at the Women International Law Group at the ASIL. And again, I think if we can take something from this webinar, is like it is a testament to international solidarity and to feminist mobilization, and like we really want to end in that note, right? That we have a lot to learn from our different experiences. That these conversations across the region are very important, and articulating with each other is like more urgent than ever. So thank you everybody for your participation. We look forward to more on this, and thank you so much to the speakers for joining us today. Have a good rest of your day, everybody.